Hello, welcome to another live Google Hangout on the Living Income Guaranteed. And today we are going to be discussing the engines of domination. Can our society and institutions be equated with an engine that creates power to benefit only a few? Do we need authority to govern ourselves, or can we achieve self-governance? We've subjugated ourselves to certain position of enslavement and having just a few in power. But currently, I consider that we're waking up to the realization that we've got to act and actually take responsibility for the power and the responsibility that we've delegated to a few. So today we're going to be discussing with Mark Corske, author of the book Engines of Domination, and also the inspiration for the documentary with the same name by Justin Jezewski. So Mark is here to discuss with us about his theory of political power and the necessary considerations for actions and solutions from his perspective. So hello, Mark. Great to have you here.
Hi, Marlen. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Thank you very much, and also for your time. For our viewers, please keep in mind that you can place comments and questions throughout our live transmission, which will be about 40 minutes, more or less, depending on the extension of the topic, of course, which is a little bit extent, of course. So I'd like to present Mark according to how he presents himself as a homegrown political philosopher. He studied mathematics and physics at the University of Colorado. He currently lives in New Mexico, and he dedicates his life to writing and teaching, of which we very much appreciate his work and effort to explain the problem that he will be sharing with us today. So, Mark, I'd like to first begin with you explaining, if you can place a concise and brief summary of your political theory that ends up with the idea of we need to abolish political power.
I'll do my best to make it as short as I can. The documentary took an hour, but I think I can do it in a couple of minutes. Why do we have political power? Why do we have armed institutions where authority is concentrated into a very tiny privileged center, and a very destructive center, a center that wages war, that until the last 100 years practiced slavery, a center that today is destroying the habitat at an alarming rate through the industries that support it and the industries that it cultivates and defends for corporate profit? Why is it this way? Is it human nature to form such institutions? Do we naturally come together around extremely powerful and privileged elites of rulers that maintain their position through institutions that are heavily armed and that commit enormous brutality in wars and so forth? Are we a violent and destructive species that has brought the world to the brink of what I call the human emergency, where we're at risk of nuclear war and other nuclear disasters? The habitat is being destroyed. We're at risk of biological catastrophes like have been possible before, global pandemics, while the climate changes, massive famines as the monoculture of genetically modified crops becomes vulnerable to new diseases, whatever, and personal disasters, spiritual disasters, as this corporate culture expands around the world and wipes out traditional livelihoods, isolates people, conditions them to live on a very superficial level, like I like to say, no deeper than a computer monitor screen. Is it human nature to live this way? It seems like it ought to be, because when you look at any other creature acting in its habitat, you decide what its nature is by seeing what it does. And this is obviously what we do. Well, my theory begins by saying people are doing this today, but first, it's only a very small part of our species that's doing it. It's the institutions of power run by elites that amount to a few % of the population that are causing this human emergency and that are in control of the destructive institutions. Second, if you look at our whole human family history of 250,000 years, these kinds of institutions only appeared 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. That's less than 3% of the time we've been on the planet. For the rest of the time, we lived in Communities, people always have. We're primates, we're community creatures. We live in communities that, judged by the historical evidence, didn't operate anything like the institutions of political power. These communities did not have palaces, temples, distinguished graves where rich rulers were buried. There's no evidence that they had anything like armies. They probably had conflicts. They undoubtedly had some kinds of leadership structures, differences in status, but nothing like the difference between an emperor and a slave. So something dramatic happened 6,000 years ago when the institutions of power that we live under today began. And I think the answer is fairly simple. What happened? If you look at what sets us apart from other species, the two distinctive things are tool making, which actually goes back to the earlier hominids. It goes way back beyond Homo sapiens. Tool making and harnessing external sources of energy. For example, domesticating animals, or things like channeling water in irrigation systems, were tool makers and harnessers of external sources of energy, especially domesticators. What happened 6,000 years ago, I believe, was an innovation, when small groups of men discovered how to domesticate entire communities, in the same way that those communities had domesticated their livestock and other animals. That was a brilliant innovation, and I think it was probably an inevitable step, because people try everything. People are ingenious, creative creatures, and it doesn't take many people with the intention to dominate their fellow human beings to get control of an entire community if they do it the right way. There's only certain ways you can do it. Like there's only certain ways you can build an axe. You have to have a hard enough chopping head, and you have to have it securely fastened to the handle. So I view political power as a tool for making tools of human beings. And like any tool, it can only be effective if it's made in certain ways. In particular, I think it's best understood as an engine. An engine's a device that converts energy into useful work. A windmill's an engine. It uses the energy of wind to turn a mill wheel. A car engine converts the heat energy of exploding fuel into the motion of the wheels. The human energy that this engine, which I call domination for short, the energy that it converts is the human energy of a community and the roots of its habitat. And it converts those into people acting in ways, into human action that serves the authority and privilege of the rulers. So in order to do that, it has to be built to convert human energy in certain definite ways, which I call the components of the engine. I think it probably would take us a little beside the point to go into those in any detail, but there are several distinct things it has to do. Then once that tool is operational, like any tool, it has unintended consequences. When you chop wood, you get a pile of wood chips and you get a loud noise. You didn't mean to make a loud noise when you were chopping wood. You didn't mean to get a sore shoulder if you do it too much. Any tool in use creates unintended consequences. This tool, this engine of domination, once it's in operation, just to secure authority and privilege for the rulers, it has to cause certain other inevitable unintended consequences, such as war, in order to conquer other communities to gain their human energy and riches when yours run out. A relentless search for greater means of destruction to make you more effective in war. An expansion of power, an increase of power, as small regimes grow into larger ones, and then into empires, and then finally into global empires as we have today. And as it does that, as it becomes more powerful, subjugates more people, consumes more resources, it damages the habitat more. And then finally, when you refine any tool, it becomes more effective and does more of what it was designed to do and causes its unintended consequences more intensely. So over the last 6,000 years, the engine has been greatly refined, largely by obtaining new sources of destructive energy, from horsepower to gunpowder to steam to high explosives to nuclear energy. And as it's become more and more effective, its unintended consequences have ultimately resulted in the human emergency. So essentially my argument is that political power, armed central authority, is an innovation that leads to a process that is unsustainable, to a process that will destroy the world if it's not halted, and it's on the brink of it right now. So the obvious conclusion is that we have to do away with the thing one way or another. We have to abolish it. We have to rid ourselves of such institutions and somehow or other make sure that they never arise again. And that simply means a world without these institutions of intense concentrations of power and privilege, and without their tremendous means of destruction and control. And I call that anarchism, a world where it is not a matter of rulers and subjects, not a matter of dominating institutions, forcing people to do what's best for the ones who are dominating them, but a world of people cooperating, sharing, and freely creating whatever ways of living work best.
So anarchism, now that you went into it, has gotten a lot of negative connotations, and for a while I've been wanting to discuss anarchism, and I know that you have a very finite or very definitive way in which you want to express it. So if you can share with us, and also making a distinction from what you don't want anarchism or your perspective of it to be associated with.
Well, since the word came into use about 150, 175 years ago, it's been made into a hate word by those in power because it's a tremendous threat. It's come to mean violence and chaos. There were violent anarchists. There have been terrorist anarchists. There have been attempted anarchist revolutions that have involved a lot of bloodshed. But the idea of anarchism is that the violence and chaos in the world primarily comes from political power, and that if it weren't for the political power, violence would be much, much scarcer and less intense, and chaos would be more a matter of the occasional natural disaster or miscalculation than something that's deliberately inflicted on entire countries. If you want to see violence and chaos, look at Hiroshima on the morning of August 6, 1945. There had never been such violence and chaos in the world until that moment. So the violence and chaos is a way of putting anarchism aside and not taking it seriously. The word comes from, it's coined from Greek, anarchos, no rulers, without rulers. And it's the idea that human communities, as I said a few minutes ago, do not need authoritarian rulers in order to function effectively, cooperatively, and for the benefit of the entire community. Most anarchists, I believe, are pacifists. They would even shrink from the idea of a violent revolution to overthrow political power because they hate violence. And the idea of anarchism is that order in communities arises naturally, the same way it does in other species, and the way it did for us for most of a quarter of a million years. There wasn't a designer writing a constitution for your agricultural village of 8,000 years ago. It evolved that way as people made reasonable choices and tried out various ideas and learned from their mistakes. So the idea that order arises spontaneously, a deer trail in the woods follows a very clever path, but the deer don't have highway engineers or departments of transportation. So it's the idea that I think most people actually tend to believe at some level that we can take care of ourselves, that we could figure out very well how to live if we weren't ruled by these powerful institutions, and that we should try to find a way to get out from under them.
How does voluntarism fit into this definition that you just gave in terms of what would we have to do then, and how would we organize ourselves, for example?
Voluntarism, as I understand it, is the doctrine that human relations should be conducted on a voluntary basis and that aggression should never be committed, the intentional use of force to harm another person. That's a moral principle. And I think it's one that almost everyone agrees with at some level. It's how you expect your friends to treat you. It's how you expect to be treated when you go out on the street. But I'm a little reluctant to form a theory of anarchism based on moral principles. Mine isn't. It's based on the argument that domination is inevitably destructive and causes mass human suffering and has to be removed for obvious moral reasons. If something's causing mass human suffering unnecessarily, of course it's wrong. So there's a moral component in my argument, but it's not based on one, like, for example, the theories of anarcho-capitalism are based on.
Okay, so we have a question, and this is coming from Gabriela Seves. He's saying, what possibilities do you see in making such institutions to align social responsibility, understanding also the responsibility of each citizen in the creation and sustenance of such institutions by our acceptance and allowance of the harm being done?
Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Yes.
What is to be done? What can we do about it? I don't know. I have a lot of ideas about things that can lead in the right direction. But if I thought I knew a solution to the problem of domination, that's what I would be out screaming from the rooftops to everyone. What first of all, it's very important to get clear that domination isn't human nature. Things could be different in principle, that we've got it in us to live in a much better way. It's also very important to understand that we live under extremely powerful thought control and behavior control systems that tend to channel our conception of the world and the things that we're ready to discuss and the possibility for action that we can foresee into forms that are safe for those in power. And to break free from those constraints, to learn to think in different ways, to identify how the thought control system works, to realize that one is the target of a deliberate campaign to neutralize you politically, and the things like apathy, like despair for the world, isolation from others, and the lack of an infrastructure of community organizations are all a deliberate part of the way the system keeps itself in power. Realizing that, then I think one can move on to, first of all, becoming a thought agitator, sharing one's freedom from the thought control system by asking hard questions, by challenging conventional beliefs, by, instead of staying quiet when people are saying something one believes is dangerous or mistaken, finding ways to speak up and challenge it, standing up for one's own beliefs, thinking in public. And I suggest in my book that people might consider forming thought groups, think groups, to support each other in this, because it's difficult. One is up against a great deal of criticism and censure doing that. There were the women's groups, the consciousness raising groups back in the 70s, and there were study groups during the Vietnam War. Why not have a pizza party and get together with some friends and talk about thinking for yourself and thinking in public? Make it an issue. Take action against the thought control system that way. Second, what people can do is engage in any kind of community building, to build, even at the most rudimentary scale, like a community garden or a food co-op in one's district, or a clothing sharing, a recycling center, to get together with people to make even very tiny little institutions that operate like the institutions we'd like to see in a world without domination. Not because that will build that world and displace the other ones. The people in power aren't going to just stand by and let go and say, oh, well, they don't need us anymore. We had it pretty good for a while, shucks, bye. But because it builds the community relations, because it keeps us in contact with like-minded people doing something of real value, and those networks then can form the subsoil for the actual activist organizations that address specific problems at a community level. Then small community organizations have the potential to band together in coalitions to address regional issues or national, or to form political blocs in certain conditions. So we build from the bottom up the kinds of structures we need to take action. Beyond that, I really don't know. We're facing a problem that's never existed before. I don't think we can overthrow today's military states by force. And even if we could, it would cause massive bloodshed. And failing would put us up against even greater oppression. Nonviolent resistance, boycotts, strikes, even uprisings may be necessary to really make it necessary for those in power to structurally change the institutions that they govern. I could go on and on. I really don't know, because the things that will finally make a big difference are actions that people take under great pressure. The human emergency is going to really hurt people in places. There are going to be disasters. There are going to be hardships. And when people get hurt, they naturally band together and act on their own behalf. What's going to happen can't be foreseen, but on the basis of the kinds of things I described, the ingenious, brave, daring actions that may really make a difference somewhere in the future are more likely to succeed. That's really about all I can think to say about it.
And that's about something that we very much promote here as well, with what you began saying, beginning to spread the word of what can we do and getting that collective sense of we're all in this together. And we were discussing previous to the Hangout about the dangers of individualism and how everything that has to do with community sense, collectivism, is perceived as the devil. Can you tell us more about this as part of the engine of domination?
Yes, it's a relatively recent development. Under the conventional system of thought control, especially in the West, under the Christian Church, people were taught that they had an obligation to serve others, even to sacrifice themselves for others. That giving was better than receiving. The Christian life is a life of service. Probably not many Christians practiced that, but it was certainly the ideal. That began to change, I think, in a big way under industrial capitalism, when the idea of the self-made man came into being, and social Darwinism proposed that evolution meant that the fittest survive. Nature red in tooth and claw, and society is a whole bunch of individuals who are all competing for as much as they can get of a very limited amount of goods, and that if you aren't looking out for yourself first, you're going to be left behind, and that a measure of a person's value is their success in getting stuff and making money and even attaining power. Same for a nation. The great nations, Great Britain, are great because they are the reddest in tooth and claw. They're the most ruthless, powerful, richest, because they succeed best in its natural struggle for survival. This idea of individualism began then, I would guess maybe 150 years ago, to grow. But in recent decades, it's become very explicit, and to my way of thinking, very dangerous, since the influence of Ayn Rand has become so great. I hesitate to say that because a lot of people who like my ideas are of this persuasion, this individualist persuasion. And I respect their ideas, but I really disagree. I think the polarity of the individual and the collective is a false dichotomy. We're community creatures. In a community, each individual is part of a system of relations, subgroups, traditions, conventions, expectations that involve everyone. And in a healthy community, I believe there's something called the common good, that isn't like the collective good in terms of some abstract thing called the collective, but is a real set of conditions that are required for human well-being to thrive. And if individuals aren't thriving, the common good isn't good. But if some individuals are thriving and the common good isn't good, something's wrong. So I see a balance between the community as a whole and the individuals who make it up. Both are of unique and supreme value. Neither is more valuable than the other. That's the dichotomy. I basically think that we've been led to internalize the division between those in power and those they're in power over, and make ourselves like a little autocrat running our own lives. And we're out to get what we can, just like the United States is out to get what it can. And maybe we believe on moral grounds that we shouldn't acquire it by force and by harming people, but still I think it's a very impoverished way to live, because the other dimension of life, of sharing, of cooperating, of being parts of organized groups that are working to accomplish something, is at least as fulfilling as anything one can get for oneself. And I think it makes you more of a person to be involved in those, as well as involved in your own self-interest. It does us. It divide and rule. Was apparently Julius Caesar said that, and a lot of other people. When people are divided in any way, it's easier to rule them because they aren't united against you. So once we're all divided into this pursuit of self-interest, which largely means working very hard at jobs that make money for the people we work for and make the corporations richer and richer and keep us from getting together, I can't think of a better way to neutralize us. So many people who believe that they're in favor of liberty are opposed to doing the kinds of group action and bonding together in solidarity that I'm certain will be necessary to change things.
What about education? You mentioned that as well as part of the engines of domination, but as we've also discussed in these Hangouts previously, we do want to make of education one of the platforms wherein, instead of continuing the same paradigm of authority, the teacher as authority upon the students, the relationships can change, and not only that, but also, of course, the contents and the way that this system of standardized education and merely dumbing down society becomes into an empowerment platform from the get-go as children. So you have been a teacher yourself. What can you share to us about your experience and how you lived the change in this field?
I was very fortunate as a teacher. For the first half of my career, 35 years, I taught privately. So I wasn't involved in the institution. I just had mostly college students coming to me to teach them mathematics and physics, and I was real good at it, and they got a lot out of it, and that was great. I was able to compensate for, in fact, for a lot of the bad teaching that they were being subjected to. I got to the point where when someone would come to me and say, I just learned mathematics, I would immediately say, well, when did you have your bad teacher? And they would look shocked, and they always had had a horrible experience with a teacher somewhere who convinced them that they couldn't do mathematics because the teacher was incompetent and the students' intelligence threatened them universally. That, no exceptions. Then for the second half, I was lucky enough to stumble in a job at a wonderful little hippie high school, you'd call it, here in Taos, New Mexico, where I live. A little private high school, college accredited. 9 out of 10 of our students went on to college, but it was run along very different lines from the public schools. The students were absolutely respected as individual people. There was an authority structure. It wasn't like an open schoolhouse system where the teachers were just there to help. I think that would have been much better, but it wasn't a matter of day after day of meaningless memorization, and we didn't do standardized tests. The teachers everybody could design their own courses, and the more creative the better. And the goal, which we consistently succeeded at, was to help the students develop their ability to express themselves vocally and in writing, to develop their own creative skills, whatever they were, to cooperate with each other in projects, to solve problems together. We had a daily community meeting for an hour where any issues that were going on in the school were discussed. And I should say it was a small school. There were never more than 55 students, one overflow year. But it was kept small, so everyone would know everyone, and you weren't part of this huge mass of people in your grade or your class. It really lacked most of the things that make the public schools so bad. It could have been a little bit freer, but it was wonderful to see how the kids thrived under it. The school became a little center in the community where things were a little bit more sane. We have a very, very troubled youth culture here in town, largely due to poverty and mixed ethnic backgrounds and some conflict and separation from each other. The school was a little haven from that. Had its own problems, but it was a relatively sane place where the kids really knew they were safe, that they could really speak honestly and have real friends that they could count on. So it can be different. It could be even more different from that, but it's absolutely true that education is critical. Since the 18th century, there's been explicit philosophies of education that say the masses should be trained to be parts of cogs in the system. The elites go to the elite private schools, private colleges, and are trained to be the masters. and it works very, very effectively. To me, the public education system in the U.S. at large is a perfect way of accustoming people to always be under authorities, to always be under stress, to be fined, physically confined, when you're 5 years old, to spend all day, 6, 7 hours in a big, ugly, stark building, doing things you hate for no purpose because you're told to, and basically being accustomed to either the conditions that will help you get along in jail, in the military, as a laborer, or for a fraction of the students to go on higher education and have the discipline to succeed in professional life. It's horrible, and it's absolutely indispensable to the system. Educational reform and alternative education systems have great promise as an area that people could work in to help challenge the system.
Yes, I agree that that's an area where we have to introduce ourselves as part of the solution at the same time. So moving on to what we propose as the living income guaranteed and the solution of giving a basic income to people and getting rid of this survival mode and the fear that it entails to have nothing to eat and being simply out there just fending for yourself in whichever way you can. I'd like to get your perspective on what you think of this idea and if it becomes part of the solutions that you could have ever pondered could exist or that you maybe thought of about yourself.
Well, when we first got in touch a few months ago, I looked at your proposal carefully. It's been a while, so I don't remember it well. But I thought, what a wonderful idea for several reasons. First, I think the whole way production is organized is absurd, where we have a small fraction of the population that, although rich people work quite hard on the average, they aren't just lounging around. They're not working at anything that their survival depends on. And what they're working at, frankly, compared with what a day laborer does, is not very hard work. How absurd that we have 95% of the population really struggling, and a large fraction of that, half to 2/3 maybe, struggling to make do, while some people don't need to do it at all. I believe there are ways to reorganize production so that everyone has all the conditions necessary for life. If in a money economy, that would be a living income, naturally. So I think it's a great idea, and some nations I've heard, I forget which ones, wasn't Switzerland considering it recently?
Yes, Switzerland is considering.
Some quite well-to-do nations think it's a good idea too. As you pointed out, to be relieved of this threat of not being able to survive, not being able to care for one's children, would really change how people live. But beyond its practicality, which I'm not sure about, because they need us to be desperate, the change of income distribution is a ruthless, conscious strategy to create dependence, to create fear and uncertainty that will make people work at things they hate to do much harder than they are even physiologically capable of working without hurting themselves, to make them desperate, to make them needy, and to make them have to work so hard that they don't have the time left over to challenge authority. I don't foresee that in the United States being given up without a struggle. But even if that's true, and the proposal is something that won't succeed here, I think it's brilliant, because when people hear it, they think, well, that's an interesting idea. Why couldn't it be that way? I'd sure like that. Think of what I could do if. And then carrying that question further, well, why couldn't it happen here? Why not? Why couldn't the production process be reorganized in such a way that people could be assured of a decent living? Is that could lead to very deep structural questions and thinking along a non-ideological direction, and provide a big challenge to the system in that way too. So I think it's a great idea. I'm not skeptical as I am about whether the United States is ever going to, but you can't even get food stamps. I don't think we're going to get a living income here anytime soon. But the debate can be fantastic.
Yes, and that's what really matters. And with this, I would like to wrap up this hangout. I'm having some problems with my computer right now, so I'm sorry that I have to shorten this, but I got all the gist of your perspectives also on the living income. So I'm glad to hear those words, because we do have to push for a solution in self-responsibility. Thanks a lot, Mark, for being with us and for taking the time.
Thank you, Marlen. It was fun.
And thanks to you, the viewer. We will see you next time, next Sunday, with another Living Income Guaranteed Hangout on structural violence. So we will be continuing with this topic. Mark, if you'd like to join us, you're welcome as well. So we'll talk about that later. Thank you and good night.